So the most significant enhancement that will be implemented into the TransTasman Angus Cattle Evaluation this December, and one of the most significant and important updates which has been made to the genetic evaluation in recent years, is the updating of all the variance components which are modelled in the main multi-trait component of the TransTasman analysis. And that really involves the variance components which underpin the calculation of all the EBVs, with the exception of calving ease, docility, and the two structural soundness EBVs being claw set and foot angle. So what we're going to do in this presentation is just go through and explain to you what those variance components are, what the variance components are that have changed, and also then what the effect on the breeding values of animals that we see published out of the analysis. So let's get underway. Let's start to consider about, well, what are the variance components? I suspect that's terminology which most Angus breeders don't use when they're sitting around talking about the breeding of their cattle. So if we explain those, some of the terminology which you might be more familiar with, if we start to think about what the variance components are really they're the ingredients, if you like, which underpin the calculation of the EBVs, or the estimated breeding values in the evaluation. And they include things like the adjustment factors, the heritability of different traits, and the genetic correlation that is modelled between the different traits within the evaluation. So we'll go through and just explore each of those in a little bit more detail. So the first variance component, if you like, the adjustment factors. And that really is when we have performance information, one of the first things before that information is analysed within the evaluation is that we have some pre-adjustments made to that performance measurement or that phenotype to take account of non-genetic differences in things like the age of animals at the date of measurement, the age of their mother, and also, in the case of some of the carcass traits, differences in the carcass weight of the animal. And we have different adjustment factors, if you like, or different adjustments that are made for animals of different sex, and also for animals born in different calving seasons, so particularly the autumn and the spring calving seasons. And those adjustment factors which are specific are really tailored to be most accurate for those different subsets of animals and born in different seasons. We also have different adjustment methods by the different traits. So for some traits, the adjustment which is made will be a linear adjustment. For others, it might be multiplicative, or for others, it might be quadratic. It's just whatever adjustment is most appropriate for the different trait and the different performance measurement in which we're analysing. And to give you what that might look like in practice, if we look at these two images on the screen, if the image on the left is just the raw performance of animals, we know that generally as animals get older, they get heavier. So we have that graph there of showing animals as age increases, so does weight. For the pre-adjustment, what we're trying to do is really remove the effect of the differences in age. So if we have a group of animals, contemporary group of animals, which are all weighed on the same day, and they have obviously differences in age within that group of animals, trying to account and remove the effect of those animals, like it is on the image on the right, where we basically have the same weight independent of age, and then that performance is then analysed within the genetic evaluation. So the pre-adjustments are really important in trying to remove those non-genetic effects and taking account of those so they're not reflected in the breeding values. The next variance component which is modelled is the heritability of traits. So people may have heard that term before, and really it's just talking about the proportion of variation in performance within a contemporary group that is due to the additive genetic variance or due to genetic differences versus other non-genetic type effects. Now the heritability which is modelled within the TransTasman analysis differs by trait, and generally I suppose as we take a trait and we increase the heritability, what kind of things do we see? It means if we've got a higher heritability, then the individual's own performance will make more contribution to that animal's EBV by comparison to the performance of relatives. And that because more of the difference that we see between that animal's performance and the performance of relatives is attributed due to genetics. We also see that direct measures for the trait make more contribution to the calculation of the EBV than the measures for other correlated traits. And that's really important in things if we start thinking about our carcass EBVs and how they're kind of published. So they're published as differences at an abattoir endpoint, being the endpoint which is important within the commercial production system. So we look at what information feeds into those, whether it's a relative contribution of the direct measures of those traits, be it abattoir carcass measurements or scan data. If the abattoir traits have a higher heritability, then they will make more contribution to those breeding values relative to, say, the scan traits. Likewise, if it's a lower heritability, then the scan traits would make, and depending on the correlation, but would make a relatively higher contribution to those EBVs. Also, traits with a higher heritability will have a higher accuracy value, so a higher EBV accuracy value next to them, all other things being equal. And importantly, the heritability also has quite a big impact on the spread that we see in the EBVs. So we've got the same, I guess, difference in performance measurements. The more of that difference, which is attributed to genetics, the more spread that we see in the EBVs, or more difference that we see in the EBVs between animals. The last variance components, which are relevant in this kind of context, are the genetic correlations between traits. So that's really just the genetic relationship that exists between the traits and how that's modelled in the genetic evaluation. And really a way of considering that is if we just change the genetics for one particular trait through selection, then what kind of change would we expect to see in other traits just due to that genetic relationship? So if we just made selection for 400-day weight, what change might occur in other traits like 600-day weight or carcass weight or even birth weight due to that genetic correlation? And the higher the genetic correlation between traits, I guess the more information on that correlated trait will contribute to the EBV by comparison to the direct measurement of that trait. And that's really particularly important. The genetic correlations which are modelled within the evaluation are really important when we have traits which we don't routinely measure. So for a trait like retail beef yield, where we don't routinely get phenotypes on animals where they're in the abattoir and they're boned out to measure the amount of saleable meat out of that carcass, it really does rely heavily, those EBVs which are published for retail beef yield, on the genetic correlations which are modelled within the genetic evaluation. Now the variance components, being those three components, the adjustment factors, the heritability and the genetic correlations between traits. Importantly, the ones that are modelled within the TransTasman Angus Cattle Evaluation are specific for Angus cattle. So they're estimated based on all the performance information which has been contributed to both Angus Australia and also Angus New Zealand. So that the variance components, that is analysis of that performance information, and the adjustment factors and the heritabilities and the correlations which are modelled are specific and the most appropriate for that performance information which is being analysed in the TransTasman analysis. And in that way, the ones that we model in the TransTasman Angus evaluation will be different to what's modelled in other genetic evaluations for other breeds. So different to what's modelled in the Hereford analysis, different in the Brahman, different in the Wagyu, etc., with the variance components in each of those evaluations being appropriate and basically estimated off that specific breed's data. Now the variance components in which we model are not updated every analysis or every year, but rather they're periodically updated from time to time. So the variance components which were used in the current analysis were last updated in April 2014, so about 8 years ago, and that was when they were implemented, and that was actually off a data set from May 2012 is where the research was done to calculate the variance components in which we use. So it's been 10 years, and as such it's very timely that we go through and update and review those variance components. So over the last 2 years, it's really been a very long project and a very comprehensive project. It's been conducted by the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit, or AGBU, in Armidale, to go through and review all those variance components and re-estimate them so that we can update them in our genetic evaluation. And I really want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the scientists at AGBU, in particular Dr. Gilbert J. Rubin, who's undertaken and led most of this research, but also some of his colleagues which have played a pretty active role in terms of Dr. Steve Miller, Dr. Andrew Swan, Dr. David Johnson, Dr. Brad Wormsley, and also Dr. Natalie Connors, who have all met with us monthly over the last 2 years as we've worked through this project, alongside our colleagues at the Agricultural Business Research Institute in Armidale as well, or ABRI, who are the commercial providers of the genetic evaluation. And in particular, Dr. Brad Crook, who's been an active participant in this work. So it's been a large research project, a very important research project to go through and update those variance components. And it's really important to make sure that we go through and ensure that those breeding values that we're calculating on Angus animals are the most appropriate or the best estimate of the genetic merit of those animals for each particular trait. Now, alongside the re-estimation of the variance components, there has been will also be some changes, I suppose, made to the way in which some performance information is analysed or modelled within the genetic evaluation. In particular, there'll no longer be a pre-adjustment of the retail beef yield phenotypes which are collected for carcass weight. And likewise, there's been quite a major change to how the MSA marbling score data, coming out of the abattoir carcass data, how that is actually utilised within the evaluation. So previously, the MSA marble score data was just converted into an intramuscular fat measurement and then analysed as intramuscular fat within the analysis, alongside any of the intramuscular fat measurements which have been collected through the meat science lab on carcasses. Now that's been changed to a far more appropriate model, where now the MSA marble score is analysed as a particular trait within the analysis. We won't publish a breeding value, but it's still modelled as a correlated trait, if you like, and then contributes to the IMF EBV through that genetic correlation. When we start looking at the importance of updating the variance components, one thing to really note, and I'll show on the slide here with this table, is the amount of information which is available on which the variance components can be estimated. Now, for a lot of our traits, and in particular, say our weight traits and our scan traits, back in April 2014, there was already a lot of data recorded, and there is a lot more data now, but we already had a pretty good data set before on which to calculate those variance components. The key advantage this time, and the key step forward, is that the amount of information available for the abattoir carcass traits and also for net feed intake is significantly higher. So we can now estimate those variance components with far more rigour and ensure that we're actually utilising those phenotypes or those performance measurements that are taken on abattoir carcasses and also in our research trials for net feed intake, can analyse that performance far more appropriately and therefore make sure we're utilising it in the best possible manner within the genetic evaluation. And so this time I really want to take time to reflect, I guess, on some of the foresight of both our predecessor here at Angus Australia in Dr. Peter Parnell, but also the directors of the Angus Australia board at the time, back in 2010 when the Angus Sire benchmarking program was established. So the Angus Sire benchmarking program had a couple of objectives, and we will have seen the benefits in terms of progeny testing modern bulls, also building a comprehensive genomic reference population. But the third objective was really to generate data for the validation and refinement of the TransTasman analysis. And it's only now that we're really seeing that come into kind of effect, when we've now got this great data set for those hard to measure traits in which we can estimate those variance components and really improve the estimate of the breeding values that have been published on animals in the TransTasman Angus Cattle Evaluation. So it's provided an invaluable data set for those hard to measure traits. And if I show you what that means on the slide, if we look at, say, the amount of dressed carcass weight performance information that we have on animals within the genetic evaluation by observation year, you can see that there was some information coming in kind of in the 1990s and 2000s. But since the Angus Sire benchmarking has kicked in, we've now got really good quality data and a lot more data than what we previously had before. And that's even further highlighted with retail beef yield. So retail beef yield, when we take carcasses in the abattoir and we break them down and actually measure the amount of saleable meat that we have out of that dressed carcass compared to, say, waste, you can see that the amount of data that was available, there's some data collected in the beef CRC in the kind of mid-1990s. There was a little bit of data collected in different research trials, but effectively not much of consequence through the 2000s. But now through the Angus Sire benchmarking program, and in particular a collaborative project with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, we've now got, for the first time in a long time, a really good sizable data set of retail beef yield data on which we can estimate these variance components. And that's only been possible through the Angus Sire benchmarking program. So just to reflect for a minute here and just look at what the take-home messages are so far. So importantly, the major update which will be made to the genetic evaluation in December this year is the updating of all the variance components in the main multi-trait component of the analysis. And those variance components being the adjustment factors, the heritabilities and the genetic correlations are really the key ingredients in the EBV calculation. Those variance components were last updated in April 2014. But now it's considerably more data available, and so we've got that, can now utilise that additional data to update those variance components and improve the manner in which we're utilising all the performance information in the calculation of breeding values. So what changes? So if we move on now to what changes, all the variance components have been re-estimated. What are the major differences? And if we start just at a very broad level, really we could say there's been minimal changes in the variance components which have been estimated for the weight traits, for the scan data, and also for the fertility traits. So as I mentioned before, there was quite a lot of data available for those before, and even though we've got significantly more data now, really we're coming up with a pretty similar estimate and not much changes within the genetic evaluation. The major change is how we're utilising abattoir carcass data and also how we're utilising net feed intake data within the evaluation. And within the different variance components, the major changes are really to the adjustment factors and to the trait heritabilities. The actual genetic correlation between traits is pretty well unchanged. So again, we'll go through now and explore that in a little bit more detail. So if we look at the adjustment factors first, and on this screen here, we've just got 4 different graphs reflecting the adjustment factors which are utilised for the abattoir carcass traits. And on each of those graphs we have 3 different lines. So the blue line, first of all, is just the raw performance information. So if you like, for IMF and rib and rump fat, we could see there that, as a carcass gets heavier, then we got an increase in either the amount of fat or the amount of IMF within the carcass. So it's important then also for carcass weight, you can see as animals got older, the carcass weight increased. So it's important as part of that pre-adjustment that we try and remove as much of the effects of the differences that we see in the performance for those different traits that are due to differences simply in carcass weight or are due to differences in the age of the animal on the day of kill. So the red line on that graph then is basically the phenotype after the adjustment has been made based on the current analysis. And then the green line is actually with the new adjustment. And you can see before, while the adjustment was attempting to remove the effect of differences in carcass weight or differences in age, it wasn't actually going the full way. So it was removing some of the effect, but not all of the effect. But now with the green line, which is far more horizontal, if you like, so it's removing far more effect of differences in carcass weight and age, in the case of the carcass weight EBV, and therefore those EBVs will be utilising that performance information, honing in in a far better way, honing in on the actual genetics of those animals for each particular trait. If we look at the heritabilities, so we go through, if we start looking again for kind of birth and growth and scan traits, not really much change. There's a little bit of kind of modification, if you like, and if anything, there's been an increase in the heritability of some of those traits, but the kind of changes are all pretty marginal, and the heritabilities which will be modelled in the genetic evaluation going forward for those traits are pretty similar to what we have been doing traditionally. The major changes actually start to occur over on the right-hand side of the graph here. So first of all, if I just note on days to calving, so days to calving already had a very low heritability, now has an even lower heritability. And the kind of effect we see on breeding values is that means that the spread, particularly in the EBVs, will shrink a little bit, so there won't be as much variation. And then that flows through to the actual selection index values, which are calculated for animals. The biggest change by far, however, is in the carcass traits. So we now have, for some traits, a considerable increase in the heritability. And then for traits like rib fats and also retail beef yield, we also have a significant decrease in the heritability. And that therefore really does impact on how that abattoir carcass information is analysed in the analysis, and then that flows through into the EBVs and then onto the selection index values for animals. Likewise, for net feed intake, we do see a slight decrease in the heritability of those different traits. So again, I guess the take-home message across all of that is, for similar to the adjustment factors, we have very similar kind of estimates of these variance components for the weight, scan and fertility traits in the case of scrotal circumference, but the major variation starts to occur in the carcass, the feed efficiency, and in this case the days to calving EBV. Lastly, just the genetic correlations. This just gives you an indication, I suppose, of the genetic correlations between traits for the carcass traits. And as you'll see as you work down the kind of graphics on the screen there, with the old correlations on the left-hand side and the new correlations on the right-hand side. There's some subtle changes as we move, and some traits might move from a negative 0.05 correlation to a positive 0.05 correlation. But realistically, there's not really much change in those genetic correlations, and those kind of changes will have pretty minimal impacts on the EBVs which are calculated in the evaluation. So if we move from the variance components and what's changed to, well, what does that then flow on to the EBVs? And a similar kind of story, and hopefully starting to see a bit of a theme now, is that with the updates to the variance components, we see pretty minimal changes in the breeding values which are calculated for the birth traits, for the weight traits, and for the scrotal size EBVs. The major change, and it is a considerable change and a bigger change than what we've seen in breeding values for some time, are to the carcass EBVs, the net feed intake EBV, and also to the days to calving EBV. We also do see that flow through to selection indexes. So not only will the EBVs change for animals, but we'll also see changes in the selection indexes based on the correlated effect, if you like, or the flow-on effect from the change in the EBVs. We also see quite significant differences in the EBV accuracies which are published. So particularly due to things like changes in that heritability, that really then does reflect the actual EBV accuracy which is published alongside each EBV. So if we delve into that in a little bit more detail, this table on the screen here just starts to show you the kind of change that we might expect to see at a population level in two different groups of animals. So on the left-hand side, we have here the young bulls, and I think they're 2020 born male calves, so they're 2-year-old kind of male calves. And we have sires, so sires that they've got some more accuracy in their breeding values. And there are two different types of statistics provided here. First of all, the correlation, and the correlation really reflects the re-ranking that we see in how animals sit on those different EBVs. And for those of you that might be familiar with correlations can kind of range from +1, if it's +1, then everything is ranked exactly the same as it was before. If it was -1, then it'd be in completely the opposite direction. And a correlation of 0 is, by definition, there's no relationship between how animals rank on the previous and the new set of EBVs. So the first thing you'll see if you look down those columns is the general alignment of the EBVs. The correlations are all close to 1. They're all kind of above 0.85. So there's general alignment, but for some particular traits there is a significant re-ranking. And the other variable, which I missed talking about, is the regression. So the regression therefore goes through and really reflects what the slope of the line is, if you like, when you compare the old and the new, and really gives us an indication of what the change in the spread or the variation that we see between animals in their EBVs. So they might still have a correlation of 1 and rank in the same manner, but the variation between EBVs can be significantly higher or less. So again, if we start to work down our kind of general correlations and general regression coefficients at a broad level, there's a general alignment, but there are some quite differences in the regression coefficient. If we look through the particular traits now in a bit more detail, as we've seen, and a common theme starting to work through, is there's really not much change in those breeding values for the kind of birth traits, for the weight traits, and into scrotal circumference. So for both the young bulls and the sires, we have a correlation close to 1. and pretty much a regression coefficient as 1 as well. So when they're a value of 1, pretty much ranking the same, similar kind of spread in EBVs. The big changes we see again are down towards the bottom when we get into the days to calving EBV, the carcass traits, into net feed intake, and then through to the selection indexes. So you'll see here, for the young bulls there, genetic correlation's kind of down at that 0.95 kind of range. For the male, for the bull, the size, they are slightly higher, so more at 0.97, 0.98. But significant differences in the regression coefficient. So when we start to see regression coefficients about 1.2, that means there's a lot more variation in the EBVs, and that reflects the increase in the heritability of those traits. Retail beef yield is one which is the reverse of that. So correlated with the reduction in the heritability of that trait, we have significant re-ranking, so 0.89, there's a lot of re-ranking. And those regression coefficients down at 0.53, really there's a lot of shrinking of the variation. So won't be nearly as much variation as retail beef yield EBVs as what we've seen before. And then as we flow down to net feed intake and the selection indexes, you'll see those correlations kind of between that 0.9 to 0.95 for the young bulls, kind of 0.96 to 0.98 for size. And actually less variation in those index values, so a decrease in that regression coefficient. If we move from the population level to start to look at what that might look like on individual animals, and this is a horrible graphic, but one that does tell a story. This looks at the 50 most widely used bulls within the breed in the last 2 years, so those sires which are being used in the industry. And it looks at how much re-ranking they get in terms of their percentile value. So if they had a value on this chart of a 0, that would mean it is ranking in exactly the same percentile band as what it was before for that trait. So if it was at 20 before, it'll be at in the 20th percentile band moving forward. If it's a negative value, it means it's climbed up the percentiles a little bit. So if it was at negative 10, it will have moved up 10 percentiles bands. So if it was at the 20th percentile before, it'll now be in the 10th percentile. Likewise, if it had a value of plus 10, it's gone down the percentile bands by 10. So if it was in the 20th percentile before, it'll now be in the 30th. So a couple of take-home messages. First of all, you'll see that there is some pretty big re-ranking and changes in EBVs at an individual level, at an individual animal level. Next message I'd suggest is there's not much colour, if you like, on the left-hand side. So we start to look across the birth and the kind of weight traits. Animals are pretty well sitting exactly where they were before, but we get far more colour highlighted on the right-hand side. So we get far more re-ranking of animals, as we've talked about, in those carcass traits, in net feed intake, etc. And those changes can be quite significant in some cases. So while most animals will probably sit within the 10 or 20 percentile bands of where they were, there are some cases where they've moved as much as 50 percentile bands compared to where they sat before. So significant changes in what we expect to see in terms of those EBVs for those well-used sires. And that'll be reflected across the whole population at a kind of individual animal level. Now, one of the other things to note, I suppose, that is with the change in the EBV spread, we also see some changes in those EBV reference tables. So I've just got a example here for IMF, where again, if you note, I said the regression coefficient for IMF, I think, was around 1.2. So we got an increase in the spread. That really means when we start to look at that, animals which were in the top 1 percentile before had values of 4.6. They're now at kind of over 5. Likewise, at the bottom end, they were around 0. They're now down at close to -1. So we've seen a greater spread in those EBVs. And really that means that people will need to go through and start to re-benchmark themselves as to what they think an acceptable EBV is in their breeding program. So if they had a particular value in mind, that now won't sit in the percentiles in exactly the same position. And so they really need to go through and benchmark yourself by studying those percentile bands in a little bit more detail. It also means that even if an animal's rank hasn't changed, so effectively it was in the top 1 percentile before and for IMF, and it's still in the highest 1 percentile for IMF, its actual EBV value, the magnitude of it will have changed. So if it was at 4.6 before and it's ranking exactly the same, it'll now be at 5.3. Likewise, if it was at the bottom end, it was previously at minus 0.1. If it was in the lowest 1 percentile, then it will now be at negative 0.7. So people, where animals sit and kind of the benchmarking with those percentiles will take a little bit of getting used to. Now, importantly, while we've talked about change, the obvious question is, well, is it change for the better? So we go through, we've re-estimated all these variance components, and I've told you it's very important, but does that actually then correlate through to the reliability, if you like, of those EBVs which are being published on Angus animals in the TransTasman Angus Cattle Evaluation? I'd really like to commend the scientists at AGBU, who again have gone through and not just done the parameter estimation, but have done some pretty solid validation of the EBVs, which will now be published in the new analysis, if you like. So they've conducted a range of different forward prediction analyses, and just to give you some idea of that, that really reflects if what has been conducted is where we've got all the information in the current analysis. And AGBU have gone through and removed all the performance measurements on animals born from 2018 onwards and used those animals as a bit of a validation data set. So they've gone and calculate EBVs with all that information, that performance information removed, and then calculate the EBVs which are calculated on those animals in 2018 forward on the subsequent performance measurements of those animals. So really use that to validate, well, does the breeding value actually reflect the performance information what we see when those animals were measured in the population? So we have a graphic here which provides three different kind of criteria, if you like, for assessing the robustness of these EBVs or really validating those EBVs. So the first column is the prediction accuracy, and the prediction accuracy is reflecting how closely the performance information reflects the EBVs which are published, and generally, if you like, the higher values are indicating that it's doing a better job. It's got a higher prediction accuracy. And you can see down the board, those values are all quite high. When you start to see similar kind of validation statistics coming out of different genetic evaluations, both in Australia and also around the world and in different species, those prediction accuracies are very high. So values, particularly say for the growth traits at 0.8, we get down to the carcass traits at 0.6 to 0.7. They're doing a really good job of predicting breeding value of animals. There's also a bias value there's put there, which is just giving you an indication of where there's any systematic bias in the EBVs which are calculated. And ideally, you want a value there of 0. And as you can see down the different traits, that bias is pretty close to 0 all the way down. And the third value is the kind of dispersion. So this is really giving us a reflection of whether the EBVs are over or under predicting the breeding value of animals. And you want, again, a value here of close to 1. And you can see generally down the board, we have values pretty close to 1. So there's been comprehensive validation done of the new information, and Angus breeders can really have confidence in those EBVs moving forward, that not only are we now utilising more up-to-date variance components, but the EBVs which are being published are doing a good job of predicting the breeding values of animals, and that's really been proven by some science at the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit. So that kind of brings us to an end of this presentation. So just some take-home messages just to go back and reflect on kind of the conclusions from this presentation. First of all, the variance components in the analysis, in the main multi-trait component of the analysis, which includes all the EBVs except for calving ease, docility, and the 2 structural traits, have all been updated. And that has resulted in some considerable changes, particularly in the carcass EBVs, the feed efficiency or net feed intake EBVs, and base the calving EBV, and that's flowed through the selection index values. Those changes in those breeding values are twofold. They're both re-ranking of animals and also the spread that we see, or the variation that we see in the EBVs. But importantly now, the EBVs which will be calculated in the TransTasman Angus Cattle Evaluation are utilising the performance information which is available in a more appropriate manner and are a better prediction of genetic merit than what they currently were before. And hence you can continue to use the EBVs with confidence in identifying animals within your breeding program which are most aligned with your breeding objective.